Hey Aurora, how are you doing?
I'm good, Mr. Fred.
That's wonderful. Um, we've been talking about historical fiction, and so I'm going to read you a short story um, about experiences of people who lived in the Dust Bowl, which was a period of time of severe dust storms in the 1930s in parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and some neighboring states. So, when we're done, when I'm done reading this, then I'm going to ask you to respond by doing a quick write from a prompt, a question that I have written out for you. You ready?
Yep.
Ooh, Betty, come quick, said 4-year-old Marianne. Paper dolls lay forgotten on the floor as she stared out the window. Betty felt her stomach muscles tighten as she joined Marianne. On the horizon loomed a rolling black cloud. It stretched from the ground into the sky and was heading directly toward them. It's another dust storm, Marianne, Betty said, trying to stay calm. How many more would there be, she wondered. For the last 4 years, since 1932, Oklahoma and nearby states had endured dozens of such storms. Betty knew the routine. Let's get some towels from the kitchen, she said. The girls went from window to window, closing each and placing a rolled-up towel where the window met the sill. It would keep out some of the wind-blown dirt, but Betty knew that powdery dust would cover everything, dishes and cupboards and clothes and closets, long after the storm had passed. I'm scared, said Marianne. I know, said Betty, but we'll be safe if we stay in the house. What about Mommy and Daddy? Marianne asked. They're probably on their way home from the bank. They won't be able to drive in the storm. I expect they'll stop at a neighbor's home. The dust cloud hid the sun and brought an eerie darkness, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. The wind howled. Tiny particles of soil pelted the window glass. No wonder they call these storms black blizzards, thought Betty. She stared out the window. Oh no, she said suddenly. What's wrong? Asked Marianne. I thought I saw Fancyfoot. See there near the fence? Betty said in a momentary lull of the wind as she had glimpsed Fancyfoot's white markings. Betty remembered other dust storms. Sometimes, even though there was no rain, there was thunder and lightning. That would frighten Fancyfoot. Fancyfoot was Betty's colt. She had seen him born. She had named him. She helped carry his hay and clean his stall. Fancyfoot would stumble around trying to find shelter. What if he stumbled into the dry creek in bed and broke a leg? Suddenly, Betty picked up Marianne and set her in the rocker. I'm going to get Fancyfoot back into the barn, Betty said. You stay in this chair and don't move. Marianne nodded solemnly. Betty jammed on her old straw hat and pulled the brim low over her forehead. She wound a scarf around it so her nose and mouth were covered. In the storeroom near the kitchen, she found her mother's long clothesline. She wrapped one end around her wrist and tied it in a knot. Then she plunged into the storm. The wind whipped the clothesline from her hand. Sandy grit pounded her face. Oh, almost. Thank you. Betty closed her eyes and groped her way to the porch railing. Bracing herself against it, she tied the free end of the clothesline firmly to one of the posts. Bending against the wind, she trudged along the house, then turned left to follow the fence. The fence ended. No Fancyfoot. Betty couldn't see more than a few yards in the swirling blackness. Then she heard him whinny, and she stumbled toward the sound. Fancyfoot, Betty called. Where was he? Again, she heard a low whinny. She turned and stepped forward. Now she thought she heard him to her right. She walked backwards to keep the grip from hitting her face. Maybe the wind is playing tricks, she thought. Maybe I don't really see or hear him. But then she smacked right into him. Fancyfoot, she said with relief. You're okay. She glided her hands over his ears and neck. Quickly she looped the slack of the clothesline around his neck. We'll never make the barn, she said. I've turned around so many times I can't tell where it is. You're coming home with me. Hand over hand, Betty guided Fancyfoot along the clothesline, back to the end she had fastened to the porch. Come on, Fancyfoot, up 2 steps and we'll be safe. Come on, boy, Betty coaxed, and she pulled him into the house. All safe, Betty gasped to a surprised Mary Ann. We'll put him in the storeroom until the storm is over, Betty said. The storm continued to blow as Betty prepared supper. She sliced bread and cheese and found an apple for Fancyfoot. Then she lugged Daddy's chair over to the storeroom. Come on, Mary Ann, I'll read your favorite story and we can keep an eye on Fancyfoot at the same time, Betty said. Soon Mary Ann was asleep. Betty noticed that the wind was not as strong as it had been. Then she too fell asleep. Auga! Betty sat up, wide awake. Then she heard it again. Auga! What is it? Mary Ann asked. Our car! They're home, Betty answered. They raced to the front door. A hazy, rising sun shone on drifts of dirt piled against the house. Are you all right? Mommy and Daddy asked as they hugged and kissed the girls. We were passing Schuler's farm when the storm hit and had to stay there overnight. We were so worried. Thank goodness you're all right, said Daddy. He looked uncertainly at Betty. I noticed the barn door was open. I'm afraid we may find that Fancyfoot got out of the barn and... He stopped as Mary Ann and Betty giggled. He did get out of the barn, but he's okay. He's right there, Betty said, pointing to the storeroom where Fancyfoot stood, munching on Betty's old straw hat.
I don't think the dad's going to be happy about that.
Wow. Well, if you grab that paper that I passed out to you earlier, it's got a question for a prompt, or question prompt for a couple questions to prompt you in your quick write. So just for about 3 to 4 minutes, we're going to write about these questions. How would you describe Betty's actions during the Black Blizzard? And what does it reveal about Betty? So thinking about those questions, can you give me a quick write about the story that we just read?
Should I read it aloud?
No, go ahead and write, and then you can read it to me. You're just responding to the story and those questions.
Alright. Wait, I need to do the second question. Alright. I am done.
Okay, thank you. That was a perfect amount of time. Why don't you read to me what you wrote?
Betty was very quick to take care of her little sister and Fancyfoot. She also tried not to worry about her parents and stayed calm so her little sister would too. What it reveals about her is that she's a very kind and caring person and will do anything to keep her loved ones safe.
That's some good insight. I'd say she showed a lot of courage. I'm not sure if did they say in the story exactly how old she was?
No,
Marianne was 4, so she really needed somebody to reassure her and take care of her, didn't she? So I think you're right that, Betty had probably been through that experience before. She knew what she needed to do from watching her parents, and she did it. She took care of her sister and herself and the horse.
And the horse.
That was pretty awesome. Okay, thank you for sharing me your reflection with me. Excuse me.